Well, good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night Bible study. We are in our second week of the book of Deuteronomy. Last week we introduced the book, and we began by introducing the book not by starting with the book, but looking towards the end of 2 Kings with King Josiah as he rediscovers a scroll. And in the scroll that he rediscovers, he reads it, he weeps, and he begins to start a religious reform in Judah, but it's a little bit too late because by the time that he dies, essentially the Babylonians are at the doorstep, and within just a few years, things are gone. One of the things we talked about last week is that the book of Deuteronomy looks very differently than Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers we've studied, in that it does not look at necessarily the covenant relationship and the living out the covenant in the same way as the previous books, in that they look at it in terms of covenant relationship, but it's also, there's a lot of things you do in practice of worship that Deuteronomy is just not all that interested in. It's not necessarily interested in the sacrifice system. It's not necessarily interested in the cultic system as much as the priestly account that we find in, let's say, Leviticus. It's more interested in the relational aspect of what it means to be God's people and to live covenant relationship with God and one another. And we talked about that last week when we read the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Keep these words I'm commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you're at home, when you're away, when you lie down, when you rise. Bind them as a sign on your hand. Fix them as an emblem on your forehead, and write them on the doorpost of your house and your gates." So it's really about living out this covenant relationship with God in love of God, and eventually it'll show in love of neighbor. And one of the things we talked about is Deuteronomy begins with Moses not at Sinai, but at the end of the journey of the wilderness. And it's essentially the second giving of the law. This generation that hasn't necessarily been the generation that was at Sinai, but it's the second generation who's about to go into the land. So they're in a transition period. And before they go in, Moses is saying, before you go into the land, you've got to be a certain kind of people. Otherwise, you put into things that jeopardy of what it can be. Like, just because you're the chosen people doesn't mean that you can just get by on that. It's got to be about your relationship with God. It's got to be about your relationship with one another and those around you. So in chapter 5, we rehear the Ten Commandments, beginning with how do you relate to God, this idea of worship and piety, and then how do you relate with your neighbor, issue of justice, issue of how do you live around others, as Jesus would say, the royal law of loving God, loving neighbor as self. And we talked about when you read the Ten Commandments, especially the second table, how do you live with other people? If you begin at the end, not coveting, looking at what you have as what's yours and being thankful for it, and then move upwards. Well, if you don't covet the things that belong to your neighbor, if you don't covet your neighbor's wife, then you're probably not going to lie against your neighbor. You're probably not going to steal. You're probably not going to commit adultery. And you're probably not going to murder. Because at the end of the day, if you kind of think about it, where does all of these actions originate? Originates in here. And Jesus will talk about those things. When Jesus re-unpacks Deuteronomy, and he's very influenced by the book of Deuteronomy, as is the New Testament. So Moses is talking about the Ten Commandments, talking about the law, talking about how it's supposed to be an important part of our lives, or Israel's important part of Israel's life. Not only is it an important part of their life, but it is an important part of a constant reflection upon. recite, talk about, think about. Because in reality, when you get to 2 Kings, which Deuteronomy, the perspective of Deuteronomy helped shape the narrative, the reality is they didn't. Over and over again, they didn't. They worshiped other gods. They looked after their own interests. They coveted, they stole, they lied. They did all of these things. And the awareness is, as a people, the center of who they're supposed to be is here. And once you stop remembering, once you stop reflecting, once you stop keeping this as the center of who you are, you will begin to get off course. And that's what the Deuteronomistic history retells as it gets to the end of 2 Kings and looks backwards and essentially says, we did not live up to this covenant faithfulness that God has asked us to do. So at the end of chapter 6, verses 20 and so, when your children ask you in a time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and statutes and the ordinances that the Lord your God has commanded? And then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with the mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our great eyes and awesome signs, wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. He brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that He promised on oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good, as to keep us alive, as is now the case. If we diligently observe the entire commandment before Lord our God, as He has commanded us, we will be in the right. So chapter 7 begins to look forward. Once they move into the promised land, the reality is there are people already there. And we go back to the book of Numbers, and we can even go back to the book of Exodus and understand that there's always this sense of an awareness that there are others out there. Well, what are we going to do? Well, the book of Deuteronomy is very intentional in saying some certain things about what they're supposed to do. The reality is they did not do these things. So let's just kind of listen to it and talk a little bit about what God is asking Israel to do through Moses and why would God ask them to do these kind of things. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are about to enter and occupy, He clears away many nations before you. The Hittites, the Gerasites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivitites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations mightier and more numerous than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and He would destroy you quickly. But this is how you must deal with them. Break their altars, smash their pillars, hew down their sacred poles, and burn their idols with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples of the earth to be His peoples, His treasured possessions. So the reminder for the Israelites is when you go into the land, there are already people there with their own customs, their own traditions, their own gods, their own cultic practices. If we fast forward to the book of Jeremiah or to some others that are towards the end of the monarchy in Israel, the reality is, even archaeological evidence, the reality is they didn't do this because they continued to worship other gods. They continued to hold cultic objects. They continued to have other activities within their own homes. And at the end of the day, they probably thought, well, it's not really hurting anybody. So, even though God has commanded them to do these things, they didn't do it. Looking backwards, Deuteronomy is saying part of the reason we got in this mess is that you didn't listen. is that you didn't put God as the forefront of all things, but you regulated other things as being important. They did intermarry. They did have these things around them. It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set His heart on you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples. It was the Lord who loved you and kept an oath that He swore to your ancestors, and that the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand, redeemed you from the house of slavery, and hand of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Now therefore, the Lord your God is God and faithful God, who maintains covenant loyalty with those whom love Him and keep His commandments to 1,000th generation. One of the themes you'll see throughout Deuteronomy as you read it, and we'll read bits and pieces here and there as we go through over the next week or two, is that God reminds Israel over and over again, it is me that's doing all this. Don't forget it. It's not you. It's not your achievements. It's not your victory. It's God's victory in all this. And the reality is, as their history progresses, oftentimes they do forget. And whether it's the kings or others begin to take credit for what they do. And the reminder is, even in our lives as followers of Jesus, a lot of times we forget what God has done in our lives. And we begin to start giving ourselves credit. You know, I did all of this. This is me that did this. You know, I got through this on my own. Or without remembering, you know, God helped me before. And God has helped me through all of this. Let's skip over a little bit to chapter 8. Chapter 8 continues this theme. This entire commandment that I am commanded you today, you must diligently observe, so that you may live and increase and go and occupy the land that the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember the long way the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, in order to humble you, testing you to know that was in your heart whether or not you would keep His commandments. He humbled you by letting you hunger and by feeding you with manna, with which neither you or your ancestors were acquainted, in order to make you understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Does that sound familiar? In order that you may understand that one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord.
So what Jesus said to the devil.
Yeah, in the temptation story in Matthew, Jesus has been where? In the wilderness for what? How long? 40 days. 40 years in the wilderness, 40 days in the wilderness. And Jesus is tempted to do something on His own and to take credit for it, essentially. Make bread out of these stones. And Jesus puts in the word of what the Israelites, God has told the Israelites is what? You cannot live on bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The reality is, over and over again, for the Israelites, is that when they think that they have done it on their own, they have forgotten the journey that they've taken. Part of the reason for the journey is to humble oneself. So we think about the Lenten journey that we just went through as a church. And we talked about brokenness. And we as a church were able to write down things in our lives that we feel maybe are broken. And one day as we get closer to having those pieces get put back together in whatever way it is, the temptation is to look backwards and just to think that we did it ourselves. That we fixed our own problems and it wasn't God who did it. And the reality is, when we do those kind of things, we leave ourselves open for it to happen again, really. Or to not see that God has been with us through all of it. Verse 4, the clothes on your back did not wear out, and your feet did not swell these 40 years. Know in your heart that as a parent disciplines a child, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Therefore keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in the ways and by fearing Him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with flowing streams, with springs, underground water welling up in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and figs and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land where you may eat bread without scarcity, where you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, from hills you may mine copper. You shall eat your fill and bless the Lord your God for the good land that He has given you. I want us to think about for a moment in our lives. I think Israel's life is a remembrance, but if we're liberated from something and all of a sudden we're given everything we ever needed or wanted, what happens to us? Do we appreciate it? And you think about Lily here. Lily's going to graduate one day from high school, hopefully. You think so? Now, Lily graduated from high school, and let's just say somebody, not us, somebody had a big pot of money for her right out of high school. And just gave it to her. She had to work for it. She hadn't do anything for it. And she's set for the rest of her life. Now, hard times come later on in her life. You think she's had any kind of an assessment of, no. Sorry, Lily, I'm picking on you. You know, the reality is if you work for it, if you struggle for it, if you understand that it's a gift, but it's not a gift to be lightly used, then you appreciate it more. You're humbled by it. You know, how much sweeter are the barley and the vines and the figs and the pomegranates and the olive trees and the bread, and no scarcity when you remember that you were hungry. There's a difference. So God says, take care that you do not forget. That's one of the issues to Israel continually. They have an amnesia over and over again. Do not forget by failing to keep the commandments, His ordinances, His statutes I'm commanding you today. And in chapter 9, we get just a reminder of a very interesting story that comes back from the story of Exodus, of the covenant that was given at Sinai and how quickly God's people forgot. And how Moses has to intercede for the people. How Moses is having to lay prostrate and pray for the people. I don't want to read all of it because it is a larger section, but in verse 15 of chapter 9, so I turned and went down from the mountain while the mountain was ablaze. The 2 tablets of the covenant were in my hands, and then I saw that you had indeed sinned against the Lord your God by casting for yourselves an image of a calf. You had been quick to turn away from the Lord had commanded you. So I took hold of the 2 stone tablets, flung them from my hand, smashing them before your eyes, and then I lay prostrate before the Lord as before. 40 days, 40 nights. I neither ate bread nor drank water because all of the sin you had committed, provoking the Lord by doing what was evil in your sight. And he goes on and retells the story. In verse 25, he says, throughout the 40 days and the 40 nights, I lay prostrate before the Lord. When the Lord intended to destroy you, I prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, do not destroy the people who are your very own possession, whom you redeemed in your greatness, whom you brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Remember your servants, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Pay no attention to the stubbornness of his people, their wickedness, their sin. Otherwise, the land from which you have brought us might say, because the Lord was not able to bring them into the land He had promised them. So Moses intercedes for the people because the people have led themselves astray, which is a very interesting thing as you read Deuteronomy and then you read the Deuteronomistic history that follows of Judges, of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And you'll see Moses is kind of the opposite of most of the kings that'll follow, and even some of the judges. And that Moses, instead of leading the people astray, Moses is the one who intercedes for the people. You know, when you read especially the story of the kings, other than David and Solomon and Hezekiah and Josiah and a few others, all of them are remembered as bad. Because they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they led the people towards idolatry. And Moses is the opposite. Moses is the one who leads them back. And part of the reason that he leads them back is his focus is on the covenant relationship. It is on the living out the instruction of God at Sinai. So you can read chapter 10, and chapter 10 kind of retells the story of Moses going back up the mountain and some of the conditions for the prosperity in the land. What I'd like to do is to turn over to chapter 12. And if you're taking notes, I know all of y'all are taking a lot of notes here. Chapter 12 through chapter 26, 26:15 or so, is really the legal or the instruction of Deuteronomy. So it takes the Ten Commandments essentially and begins to talk about what does it mean to live out this covenant relationship. So today we're just going to look at a few of these, and then next week we'll kind of look towards the end of Deuteronomy at the blessings and the curses, because that is kind of a central part of the character of Deuteronomy. It is what impacts the narrative of looking backwards on Israelite history into the monarchy and asking the question, how did it get so bad that the Babylonians came, destroyed the temple, and carted people off in exile? And part of it will say, well, the blessings and curses, we didn't live up to covenant fidelity, and this is how bad it got. It'll also shape, that mindset will shape some of the prophets like Jeremiah, but it will also rub against books like Job and Ecclesiastes, because they'll say, you know, there are some bad people that do bad stuff and they get away with it. And there's some really good people that live really good lives and they still suffer. So it's not always this. We'll talk about that, and then talk about, at the end of our time with Deuteronomy, talk about how Deuteronomy is also seen, let's say, specifically in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels with Jesus. So let's just look at a little bit of some of the statutes, the ordinances that come out of Deuteronomy. The first part comes in worshiping. So let's look at chapter 12, and we'll look at several passages here and elsewhere. These are statutes and ordinances that you must diligently observe in the land that the God of your ancestors has given you to occupy all the days you live on the earth. You must demolish completely all the places where the nations whom you are about to dispose serve their gods. On the mountain heights, on the hills, under every leafy tree. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, burn their sacred poles with fire, hew down the idols of their gods, and thus blot out their names from the places. You shall not worship the Lord your God in such ways. But you shall seek the place of the Lord your God, who will choose out of your tribes as his habitation to put his name there. You shall go there, bringing there your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your donations, your votive gifts, your free will offering, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. And you shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your households together, rejoicing in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you. And you shall not act as we are acting here today, all of us according to our own desires. For you have not come into the rest and the possession that the Lord your God is giving you when you cross over the Jordan. So part of chapter 12 is just a reminder, when you get into the land, there is an ordered way of worshiping now. And part of it is that as tribes, there are ways that you will come together, you will worship. If you continue to read, it talks about the Levites. It talks about how to take care of your offerings. It's not near as detailed as you'll get in Leviticus. So if you read it, a lot of it has to do with the acts of worship, the acts of offering, the Levites taking care of it as it's done. So you can read a little bit more there. I don't want to get into too much detail on some of this. In chapter 13, it begins to talk about how do we listen, how do we stay loyal to God. If prophets or those who divine by dreams appear among you and promise you omens or portents, and the omens or the portents declared by them take place, and they say, let us follow other gods whom you have not known, let us serve them, you must not heed the words of those prophets or who divine by dreams. For the Lord your God is testing you to know whether you indeed love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. The Lord your God, who you shall follow, him alone, you shall fear his commandments, you shall keep his voice, you shall obey. Him you shall serve, and to him whom you shall hold fast. But those prophets or those who divine by dream shall be put to death for having spoken treason against the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, redeemed you from the house of slavery, to turn you away from which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. I think it's hard for us to kind of realize what life was like in the ancient world, but most places you went in the ancient world, there was somebody, if you needed to know something, you could go pay and they would tell you. I mean, you go down the Asheville Highway, you'll see a little tarot sign, somebody that'll read cards for you. Well, there was somebody in a community that could, either through dreams or throwing out bones or looking at the weather or something, would tell you, they would have divination of something that could happen, something you needed to know. And the reality here is sometimes they're right. And in being right, you might think, well, maybe whoever they're serving, their God they're serving, is right. And the reality is, once you start buying into that, you're not what? You're not completely loyal to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the reality is, many people had dual loyalties in Israel, even in the time of Jesus. Jesus is very concerned that you only love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And part of it is there's other loyalties out there that people give. Let's skip over chapter 14. It's about holiness. I just kind of want to go through these so that you can kind of read through them. I'm going to look at a couple specific ones. Let's look at chapter 16. And let's talk a little bit about we've talked a little bit about the worship of Israel. Now let's talk a little bit about how do they live with one another. So one of the things Deuteronomy does is begin to talk about how do we live with one another, and how do we, when we have disagreements within the community, when things maybe get a little bit out of hand, how do we settle as a tribal community before the monarchy? How do we settle our problems? Verse 18 of chapter 16, you shall appoint judges and officials throughout your tribes and all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall render just decisions for the people. You must not distort justice. You must not show partiality. You must not accept bribes, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the causes of those who are in the right. Justice, the only justice you shall pursue, so that you may live and occupy the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not plant any tree as a sacred pole beside the altar that you make for the Lord, and you shall not set up a stone pillar, things that the Lord your God hates. And it goes on to sacrifices there. One of the things you'll see as you read the prophet specifically is that a lot of times the reality is when you get away from true worship of God, oftentimes you get away from true justice to your neighbor. I mean, it's easy if you're not really loving God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, it's really easy to not really love your neighbor. So the time you get to the prophets will come, and they usually have two indictments on God's people. Usually the people that are in charge of worship in the temple, and usually towards the king and towards others that administer justice. And one of the things about administering justice is that you are taking bribes, or that you are using your power and authority for gain, rather than true justice. Because part of what Israel is supposed to do is embody God's justice in the world. They're supposed to be a Sabbath people, a God who liberates people from injustice towards justice. But also the reality is the more that you are an unjust society, the less you're going to really be God's people. You're not going to model God to one another and to others. So this is an issue that happens over and over again. Chapter 17, verses 2 and following, if there is found among you one of your towns that the Lord God is giving you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord and transgresses His covenant by going to serve other gods, worship them, whether the sun, the moon, or any of the host of heaven, which I have forbidden, and if it is reported to you and you hear it, you should make a thorough inquiry, and the charges prove true, that such an abhorrent thing has occurred in Israel, and then you shall bring to your gates that man or that woman who's committed this crime, and you shall stone them to death. Now, that seems really harsh, and the reality is the majority of the time it didn't happen. They didn't follow through that. But the reality is that God is asking the people, you've got to really take this serious. Verse 8, if a judicial decision is too difficult for you to make between one kind of bloodshed and another, one kind of legal right and another, one kind of assault and another, any such matters of dispute in your towns, then you shall immediately go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose, and there you should consult with the Levitical priest and the judge who is in the office in those days, and they shall announce the decision in the case. Carry out exactly the decision they announce to you. So justice in some form or fashion is very important for the covenant relationship of Israel. Chapter 18 begins talking about the Levitical priesthood. Bless you. Chapter 19, we talked about it in Numbers especially. Chapter 19 talks about cities of refuge. So one of the things that's interesting about Israel's history, whether they actually practice it as much, but in terms of the covenant relationship, is if someone has done something really, really bad. So we'll read a little bit. There are places for them to go that, one, it cleanses the communities, but it also gives them an opportunity to find some sort of avenue for rehabilitation. So let's look at 19, 1 through 13. When the Lord your God has cut off the nations whose land the Lord is giving you, you have disposed them, you've settled. You shall set apart 3 cities in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall calculate the distances and divide into 3 regions the land of the Lord your God gives you a possession, so that any homicide can flee to one of them. Now this is the case of a homicide who might flee and live. That is, someone who has killed another person unintentionally, when the two have not been at enmity. Suppose someone goes into the forest with another to cut wood. And when one of them swings the axe to cut down a tree, the head slips from the handle and strikes the person, who then dies. The killer may flee to one of these cities and live. Because in reality, let's say you go out with somebody in the woods, it might have been an accident. It might have been intentional. If it happens, don't go back home. Get away. You know, the closest thing we can maybe think about this is that in European cities for years, cathedrals and oftentimes places of worship were often sanctuaries, even for criminals. And they could go and ask for sanctuary. You've seen it in movies and different things like this. This is kind of what this is that not everything is a cut and dry. And that's kind of what this, there's some gray areas where, justice can get one way or another. But if the distance is too great, the avenger of blood is hot in anger, might pursue and overtake and put the killer to death, although a death sentence was not deserved, since the two had not been an enmity before. Therefore I command you, you shall set apart the 3 cities. And if the Lord your God enlarges your territory, He swore to your ancestors, will give you all the land that He promised your ancestors, provided you diligently observe the entire commandment that I command you today, by loving the Lord God, walking always in His ways, then you shall add 3 more cities to the 3. So that the blood of an innocent person may not be shed in the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, therefore bringing blood guilt upon you. But if someone is at enmity with another and lies in wait and attacks and takes the life of that person, and then flees to one of these cities, then the elders of the killer's city shall send to have the culprit taken from there, handed over to the avenger of the blood to be put to death. Show no pity. You shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel so that you may go well with you. You must not move your neighbor's boundary market. So some of it now begins to talk about other parts of... But it's interesting when we think about, we read the commandment, you shall not murder. And the reality is, things happen. Not everybody kills another person intentionally. It's not always out of anger. Accidents happen. And it's interesting that within the Deuteronomistic instruction here, Moses is saying, make sure there are places for people to go where somebody who's not done something intentionally, not out of hatred, will not be harmed because of somebody else's anger. I think that's interesting for me. Chapter 20 is kind of rules in how to engage war. If you'll go back to Leviticus, you'll see so many differences here. We're not reading about what kind of pots to put stuff in. We're not reading about how to cleanse things. These are very relational kind of language. The priestly account in Leviticus talking about how do you live out the law is very much into the practice of worship. And Deuteronomy is much more in how do you worship God by practicing living that out with other people. So Deuteronomy has a very different focus from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers in a lot of ways. When you go out to war against your enemies and you see horses and chariots and an army larger than your own, you shall not be afraid of them, for the Lord your God is with you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'd like to go back, somebody's got time this week, just go back through Deuteronomy and say, how many times does God remind Israel that He brought them out of the land of Egypt? Just as a reminder is that, remember, God is the one who is powerful enough to free you from the hands of a Pharaoh. We get to the book of Joshua and says, be strong and courageous. The reality is when they are forced to do hard things, a lot of times, even when they know that God's done this, they still have to be reminded. Remember, the Lord your God has brought you out of Egypt. And you shall say to them, hear, O Israel, today you are drawing near to do battle against your enemies. Do not lose heart. Do not be afraid or panic or be in dread. For it is the Lord your God who goes with you to fight you against your enemies to give you victory. Then the officials shall address the troops, saying, has anyone built a new house but not dedicated? He should go back to his house, or he might die in battle and another dedicated. Has anyone planted a vineyard, yet not gone and enjoyed its fruit? He should go back to his house, We might die in battle, and another might first enjoy its fruits, and so on and so on. When you draw near, verse 10, when you draw near to a town to fight against it, offer its terms of peace. So when you go to battle with somebody, offer them terms of peace first. Give them an option. War is not necessarily necessary. When we go back to the book of Numbers and it talks about war there, the reality is that no matter how holy a war might seem, it still affects people. And one of the things that's interesting in the book of Numbers is that those that have fought in war and battled war cannot go home until they are sanctified first. Because the reality is war causes spiritual and mental and all sorts of anguish on a person, and it makes them essentially unclean, and they have to cleanse themselves before they can go home. Even if God has directed them and been out in front of them, Numbers reminded them. So even here, the reality is peace is always better than war. If it does not submit to you peacefully, but makes war against you, you shall besiege it. When the Lord your God gives it to your hand, you shall put all its males to the sword. And you can read all the gruesome stuff there, since Lily's with us here. If you besiege a town for a long time, making war against it in order to take it, you must not destroy its trees by wielding axe against them, although you may take food from them. You must not cut them down. Any trees in the field, human beings, that they should come and under siege from you. You may destroy only the trees that you know do not produce food. You may cut them down for use in building siege work. So even in terms of using what's around you, there are good things that are to remain. Chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. What you do when somebody is murdered and it's unsolved. If in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess, a body is found lying open in country, and it's not known who struck the person down, then your elders and your judges shall come out to measure the distance to the towns that are near the body. The elders of the town nearest the body shall take a heifer that has been worked, one that has not pulled in the yoke, and the elders of the town shall bring the heifer down to a wadi with running water, which is neither plowed nor sown, and shall break the neck of the heifer there in the wadi. Then the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister to him, to pronounce the blessing in the name of the Lord. And by their decision, all cases of dispute and assault shall be settled. And all the elders of that town nearest the body shall wash their hands over the heifers whose neck has been broken. And they shall declare, our hands did not shed this blood, nor were we witnesses to it. Absolve, O Lord, your people Israel, whom you redeemed. Do not let the guilt of innocent blood remain in the midst of your people. Then they will be absolved of blood guilt. So you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst, because you must do what is right in the sight of the Lord. One of the things we don't think about, a lot of times people have this false sense that the Old Testament is overly gruesome, overly violent, that God is just very different than the God that Jesus reveals. But in all reality, Israel is aware that a death of a person by anything other than natural causes, it not only pollutes the land, it pollutes the community. And it goes back to the story of Cain and Abel, where Abel's blood is crying out for justice. It goes back to the story of the flood. Why did God send the flood? But because humanity had become so violent. And the awareness is violence and murder and killing are opposite of God's intention. To the point that when it happens and it is unresolved, justice has not been found, we don't know who did this. The blood still is crying out to God for atonement. So the reality is the people, when they encounter something they can't explain how it happened, they weren't witnesses to, they still have to purify the land. I mean, it's almost, if we were to think about like a cold case in American tradition, it is, yes, we don't know what happened here, but we're going to respect the person in such a way as to make sure that we do something for them that lets them know and God know that we are showing them respect enough to take care of their body, of who they were, and to acknowledge to God that this injustice happened. So for me, it's really interesting when we think about an ancient culture that oftentimes, Old Testament kind of things get kind of a bad rap. Well, the reality is the covenant relationship God has with God's people is that war happens, but day-to-day violence is not acceptable. It actually goes against God's created order. And when it happens, it does pollute the world. It does pollute, and God does take notice. Let's look at chapter 22, and then we'll kind of stop there tonight. Chapter 22 begins a series of, how do you live with your neighbor? So it goes from kind of some of the extremes, but towards how do you live with your neighbor? So chapter 22, verses 1, you shall not watch your neighbor's ox or sheep straying away and ignore them. You shall take them back to their owner. I mean, you've got a duty to look after your neighbor as you're looking after yourself. If your owner does not reside near you, or you do not know the owner, you shall bring it to your own house and remain there until the owner claims it. Then you shall return it. You should do the same with your neighbor's donkey, with your neighbor's garment. You do the same thing with whatever your neighbor loses, and you find it. You may not withhold your help. Okay? Pretty good. I mean, what is it? Who is my neighbor? Well, I don't know whose stuff this is. It's not mine, but it's somebody's and it's of value to them. Looking after your neighbor. You shall not see your neighbor's donkey or oxen on the road and ignore it. You shall help lift it up. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel nor a woman's garment. Whoever does such things, we'll talk about that another time. If you come in a bird's nest or any tree or on the ground with fledglings or eggs, with the mother sitting on the fledgling or eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. Let the mother go, taking only the young for yourself, in order that it may go well with you and you may live long. There's this, one of the things that is interesting when you read Old Testament stuff is that there is a sense of, if you want to cook, let's say, beef, or an oxen or something, or a sheep, you don't cook it in milk from the same animal. For the Israelites, the thought of the thing that the baby had and the mother's milk put together, so a mother and a child should not be killed at the same time. Or the thing that the animal drank as a child, there's something just, for them, there's something wrong about that. So you can take one or the other, but you will not take them both and eat them both together. There's just something, it's not quite Mr. Rogers, but Mr. Rogers says, I wouldn't eat anything that had a mama. Here is, you don't eat mama and the baby together. You don't mix them together. For them, there's something out of order with that. There's a respect for the natural world and the natural order of the world. There's also some other things that are a little odd. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. If that's all you got, it's all you got. But there's a sense of things don't often need to go together. You should not wear clothes made of wool and linen woven together. Now, there's a reason for it. I don't know what it is. Most of my clothes are mixed fabrics.
They don't shrink, but...
Yeah. Let's look at verse 13. Make sure it's okay. It's kosher. Suppose a man marries a woman, but after going with her, he dislikes her. And makes up charges against her, slandering her by saying, I married this woman, but when I spent time with her, I did not find evidence that I was the first one. Then the father of the young woman and the mother shall then submit the evidence of the young woman's innocence to the elders of the city at the gate. And the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to the man, but he dislikes her. Now he's made up charges against her, saying, I did not find evidence of my daughter's innocence, but here's the evidence of my daughter's innocence. They shall lay out the cloth here before the elders of the town. The elders of the town shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, which shall give to the young woman's father. That's our friends going down the hall. Oh, it's one of yours, Johnny. What's interesting here is that when you read these things, there's and you read later in 22 about some other things that can happen to the most vulnerable in society, is that God takes account. Oh my gosh. God takes account for how men oftentimes abuse their privilege and status within the community. And a lot of times how women are the most vulnerable, and that how God often takes the side of those most vulnerable in the society. Here it is a woman's, a man's word versus a female's, a woman's. And here there are ways to say you can't discount somebody just because you don't like what you got. I'm not going to read the next section. You can do that. It's about what happens when relationships go outside of marriage, and then what happens when someone is taken by force, and how that needs to be worked out within the community, because these things impact the community. And we talked about the 10 Commandments last week. What does God desire for Israel? To be in harmonious relationship with God and with each other. And when these things begin to happen, that begins to break apart. So there has to be some ways in which to not only instruct people on how to live with each other, but also to make sure that when people go outside of this ordered reality that God would like, where everybody's living in harmony, is that make sure that people aren't abusing, hurting others, and making sure that those that do things that are not justice-filled find justice. I'm going to stop there. Continue to read the next couple of chapters. We'll look at a couple maybe next week. I really want to start looking at the end of Deuteronomy at chapter 28 and following, the consequences of obedience and disobedience, the blessings and the curses. It's not light reading, and it's probably not reading that you want to read before bed or around children. So read it as you have time. Let me end us in a word of prayer, and then we will, if y'all have any questions, we can ask those. God, we thank you so much for another beautiful day. We thank you so much for the opportunity to study your word together, both in person and for those that couldn't be here. Lord, we ask that you will continue to guide and direct us, that we can be your people who love you with all of our hearts, our minds, our strength, and to love others as ourselves. Lord, help us to hear these ancient words and how they're echoed again in the words of Jesus, and how that we can live them out even today. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.